The White Pass and Yukon route is located on 231 2nd Avenue in Skagway, Alaska. Also, the railroad runs between Skagway, Alaska and Carcross, Yukon Territory, and it used to go all the way up to Whitehorse. And also, trains no longer do. And the railroad even crosses the Canada-Alaska border, and the trip takes you 800 feet above the Skagway River near the original trail of the Stampeders. The track gauge of the railroad is a 36-inch gauge rail line. Also, the railroad had chose narrow gauge, which was a lot cheaper, and the line was built in 1898. And the builders blasted their way through the mountain within 2 years, and the railroad was born during the Klondike Gold Rush as a means of reaching the gold fields. Also, it is a rare story in the history of the railroad building, and for the railroad, it was gold discovered in 1896 by George Carmack and two Indian companions, Skookum Jim and Dawson Charlie. Also, the railroad was all built by hand, and also crews had to blast their way through the rocky points and then sheer cliffs to get past slippery rock, then cutted through Tunnel Mountain, and then trailed a switchback through Dead Horse Gulch, and then made it up to the summit of White Pass. Also, the line was born of the Klondike Gold Rush of 1897 when a coastal steamer pulled into Seattle, Washington, piped by the headlines of stacks of yellow metals and tales of dazzling riches. The stampede up to Klondike was on. The easiest part was getting from Vancouver to Skagway, Alaska. Also, each man carried supplies to the Yukon, and many lifted over the Chilkoot one backpack at a time, and the White Pass is longer than the Chilkoot, but not as steep, and pack horses were driven to their deaths. Also, 3 separate companies were organized to build a rail link from Skagway to Fort Selkirk, Yukon, 325 miles away. Largely financed by British investors, a railroad was soon under construction. The track gauge was chosen by railway contractor builder Michael James Henney. Also, an excursion train hauled passengers for 4 miles out of Skagway and was the first train to operate in Alaska. The railroad reached Bennett, British Columbia in 1899, and in the summer that year, construction started north from Carcross to Whitehorse, 110 miles just north of Skagway, Alaska. The entire line was completed in 1900. The trestle that's on the mountain line was built in 1901 and was the tallest railroad bridge in the world and is over 215 feet above the valley, and today it is abandoned. And also, when you're on the mountain line, you even will be going through 2 tunnels, and one called Tunnel Mountain. In 1982, the railroad was closed and people thought it would never run again until in 1988 was partially revived as a heritage railway and reopened as the White Pass and Yukon route. White Pass route, I should say. Also, the train makes a stop at Bennett Lake in Bennett, British Columbia, and where you can step off the train to see the old town and also the famous Chilkoot Trail that comes into Lake Bennett and makes some stops at other stations like Carcross. And also, to see where all the train makes a stop, be sure to check the web. In 2014, there was a derailment and the line was eventually cleared up as well. Also today, the White Pass in Yukon is used as a tourist line for passengers to experience the scenery on board the train, and even has freight trains run on the rails as well. In 2018, it was announced that the railroad would be bought by Carnival Cruise Lines. Also today, the railroad is a subsidiary of Club Link and operated by the Pacific and Arctic Railway and Navigation Company, which is in Alaska, and the British Columbia Yukon Railway Company in British Columbia, and the British Yukon Railway Company, which was originally known as the British Yukon Mining, Trading and Transportation Company, which used the trade name White Pass and Yukon Route. Also, the railroad headquarters are in Skagway, Alaska as well. White Pass in Yukon 328 was built by Jeff Hamilton in 2001 and is a passenger coach. Also, the car is named Stewart River. Also, for many years, it had been used on the tracks it has been rolling on, and passengers riding on board it as well. Also, today, it can be seen on the passenger trains on the White Pass and Yukon Railroad, and people riding on board it as well. White Pass in Yukon 344 was built by Jeff Hamilton in 2004 and is a passenger coach. Also, the car is named Lake Munro. Also, for many years, it had been used on the tracks it has been rolling on and passengers riding on board it as well. Also, today, it can be seen on the passenger trains on the White Pass and Yukon Railroad and people riding on board it as well.
What you see right behind me is White House and Yukon 358.
White Pass in Yukon 358 was built by Hamilton Manufacturing in Sedro-Woolley, Washington in 2005 and is a passenger coach. Also, the car is named Lake Hutchie. Also, for many years, it had been used on the tracks it has been rolling on and passengers riding on board it as well. Also today, it can be seen on the passenger trains on the White Pass and Yukon Railroad and people riding on board it as well.
What you see right behind me is White Pass and Yukon 360.
White Pass in Yukon 360 was built by Hamilton Manufacturing in Sedro-Woolley, Washington in 2005 and is a passenger coach. Also, the car is named Lake Annie. Also, for many years, it had been used on the tracks it has been rolling on and passengers riding on board it as well. Also, today, it can be seen on the passenger trains on the White Pass and Yukon Railroad and people riding on board it as well.
What you see right behind me is White Pass and Yukon 362.
White Pass in Yukon 362 was built by Hamilton Manufacturing in Sedro-Woolley, Washington in 2005 and is a passenger coach. Also, the car is named Lake Crag. Also, for many years, it had been used on the tracks it has been rolling on and passengers riding on board it as well. Also, today can be seen on the passenger trains on the White Pass and Yukon Railroad and people riding on board it as well.
What you see right behind me is White Pass and Yukon 372.
White Pass in Yukon 372 was built by Hamilton Manufacturing in Sedro-Woolley, Washington in 2007 and is a passenger coach. Also, the car is named Lake McConnell. Also, for many years, it had been used on the tracks it has been rolling on and passengers riding on board it as well. Also, today, it can be seen on the passenger trains on the White Pass and Yukon Railroad and people riding on board it as well.
What you see right behind me is White Pass and Yukon 211.
White Pass in Yukon 211 was built by the American Car and Foundry in St. Charles, Missouri in 1918 and is a combine car. Originally was used on the Sumter Valley Railway as Sumter Valley 11 till purchased by the United States Army in 1943 as United States Army 934 for use on the White Pass and Yukon Railroad and also used as a tool car. In 1946 it was renumbered as White Pass and Yukon 211 and it had a cupola added. In 2017 it became a combine car. Also today it can be seen on the passenger trains on the White Pass and Yukon Railroad and people riding on board it as well. White Pass and Yukon 486 was built by National Steel Car Corp in Hamilton, Ontario in 1969 and is a flat car. It was used on the White Pass and Yukon Railroad and on freight trains and hauled light crates that flat cars like this one hauled and other cargo it may have hauled in the past. Also, it is sometimes carried on the tracks it has been rolling on for many years as well. White Pass in Yukon 99 was built by General Electric in Schenectady, New York in 1966 and is the 35791st diesel locomotive built by that factory and is a 90 class diesel locomotive. These locomotives have been nicknamed shovel nose because of the characteristic shape of their front end. Originally, it was built with a General Electric pattern, GEX 3341, with Alco Products Incorporated 6251B prime mover. Then, in 2010, it was converted to Clear 140 by Global Locomotive LLC with Cummins Engine Company, QSK 45L prime mover. Also today it can still be operating on the White Pass and Yukon line as well and seen pulling the trains as well. White Pass and Yukon 103 was built by the Montreal Locomotive Works in Montreal, Canada in 1969 and is the M6023-3rd diesel locomotive built by that factory and is a DL 535E type diesel locomotive. Originally, it had been used on the White Pass and Yukon Railroad. Then, in 1992, it was sold to Sociedad Colombiana de Transporte Ferroviario SA and renumbered as Sociedad Colombiana de Transporte Ferroviario SA 1103. Then, in 1999, it was bought back to the White Pass and Yukon Railroad and to its original number as White Pass and Yukon 103 as well. Also today, it can still be operating on the White Pass and Yukon line and as well and seen pulling the trains as well. You can see right here, this is a hand car that's displayed here at the station here in Skagway, Alaska at the White Pass and Yukon. And also, it is just part of the memorabilia, the railroad memorabilia here. And also, it once was used on this railroad. And it even helped to maintain the railroad. And today it's on display. What you see right behind me is White Pass and Yukon 909. White Pass in Yukon 909 was built by the Colorado and Southern Railroad in 1910 and is a wooden caboose. Originally, this car was built as a boxcar and used on the Colorado and Southern Railroad, and original numbers unknown when it was used for that railroad and was used on freight trains on that railroad as well, and hauled cargo such as boxes, crates, and all other different types of cargo in the past. Then, in 1943, it was converted to caboose flanger by Chicago Freight Car Parts Company and was bought by the United States Army for use on the White Pass and Yukon Railroad and renumbered as United States Army 90857. In 1944, it was renumbered as 857. Then, in 1946, was sold to the White Pass and Yukon Railroad and renumbered as White Pass and Yukon 909, and it was soon rebuilt as a caboose. Also in 1968 it was retired, and then later it was put back into service in 1998. Then later on it was put on display in this spot at the White Pass and Yukon Skagway station in Skagway, Alaska, where it is today.
What you see right behind me is White Pass Yukon 1.
White Pass and Yukon 1 was built by Cook Locomotive and Machine Works in Paterson, New Jersey in 1899 and is a rotary snowblower. This rotary snowblower was used for the White Pass and Yukon Railroad in Alaska and would be used for blowing snow off the tracks being used on the White Pass and Yukon Railroad. In 1944, it received a 190 class tender. Then, in 1947, it was given the tender from White Pass and Yukon Steam Locomotive 80, which is a 282 Mikado and is currently in McEwen, Oregon, and numbered as Sumter Valley 20. Then, in 1950, it received the tender from White Pass and Yukon Steam Locomotive 70, which is also a 282 Mikado and is at Dollywood in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. Then, in 1953, it exchanged tenders with White Pass and Yukon Steam Locomotive 190, which is also a 282 Mikado and is part of the Tweetsie Railroad in Blowing Rock, North Carolina. The original tender was assigned to White Pass and Yukon Rotary Snowblower 3 in 1947, and then in 1951 was placed as a riprap along the Skagway River. In 1962, it was retired, and then in 1995, it was restored to service and continued to work. Then, later, it was back in retirement, and also it is on display in this spot at the White Pass and Yukon Railroad Station in Skagway, Alaska, where it can be seen today. Also, White Pass and Yukon 1 is like one of only 5 known narrow gauge rotaries still in existence and can be seen on display in this spot where it is today.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed learning about trains with me today in Matthew Lap Train Guy segment show. Also, I hope to see you all again in the next segment. So this is Matthew Lap, host of Matthew Lap Train Guy segment show, signing out. Until next time, all aboard.